All right, folks, Gene Galin here from the Chatham Journal, and I'm with David Galin from NC Sports Network. We're going to talk about the four ACC schools in North Carolina. We're going to talk about UNC, Duke, NC State, and Wake Forest. Do we want to save the best for last? You said there's one of those four is the most interesting. Do you want to save that one for last, or do you want to kick off?
Your call, because you're in charge, Gene.
That's a difficult. Why don't we start with stuff closer to Chatham County? Let's start off with UNC.
Okay.
One of the things we don't have to worry about this year is any new coaches. They're all coming back. So what do you see on the horizon for UNC this year? Improvements? Overall, just your overall feel of where UNC football is coming for 2026.
I don't have a great vibe about it. Do they have a chance of being better than 4-8 last year under Bill Belichick? Yes, they have a chance to be better than 4-8. Do they have a chance realistically to be in, let's say, the top 6 in the Atlantic Coast Conference? Probably not. There's a lot of moving parts. They lost their best linebacker, Kamari House, to a transfer. They lost other key players to the professional ranks or graduation. They have to break in a new quarterback. They have a new offensive system, and there were some questions about, Gio Lopez now at Wake Forest raised questions about how happy the Tar Heels are under Bill Belichick and whether it's a fun environment. Nobody doubts the guy's NFL credentials; those speak for themselves. But college football is a different animal. Year one was not pretty for the Tar Heels. You would think a Hall of Fame coach would leave more of his fingerprints on his second team in Chapel Hill, but I think everybody has to take a wait-and-see attitude, because it's not as if the pure talent jumps off the page, right? Damon June's a really talented running back. Jordan Shipp's a really talented wide receiver. Melkart Abujade is a really talented defensive end. How much longer is that list for the Tar Heels? I don't know if we're sure of the answer to how many additional difference makers they have than the guys I just listed. And in this league, you need difference makers if you're going to do better than 4-4 in the ACC and 6-6 overall.
What do you think about their trip to Ireland?
That's fun. I'm in favor of such things. I was disappointed for UVA fans and NC State fans when that originally scheduled for Brazil game got moved back to the United States. So I'm a believer that variety is the spice of life. That's one of my favorite quotes. I was one of those that, even though I love the ACC men's basketball tournament in Greensboro or Charlotte, I'm not upset if I go to Brooklyn sometimes, or Washington, D.C. sometimes, or Atlanta sometimes, or Tampa one time. I'm kind of cool with the variety, even though I agree that event is more celebrated here in our state than it is elsewhere. Similarly, I don't want season ticket holders to lose home games very often, but when it gets great exposure for your program and it gives your fans a rare opportunity to travel internationally, I think those games occasionally are a lot of fun. Carolina just has to do better. They have to look like they belong on the same field with TCU this time, because they did not look like they belonged with the Horned Frogs last year when that game was at Chapel Hill.
How much of a runway does Bill Belichick have, if you want to touch on that?
Given his age in his 70s, the runway can't be longer than 3 years. This is year 2 for him. I think he needs to show improvement. I mean, his GM, Mike Lombardi, and he did not build a high-quality football team in year 1. Now, they have complained that they didn't really have enough time to build their first team, and that the portal happened too quickly for them to have an evaluation process. Well, my first comeback to that is that Jake Dickert of Wake Forest was hired on a similar timetable and had to deal with similar complications, and still cranked out a pretty good football team at Wake Forest, even without a great quarterback last year. So I think that explanations can become excuses, and I'm not sure how much benefit of that doubt that Bill Belichick deserved last year. But even if you take them at their word, and that this is a more well-constructed, with more time to constructed football team, well, then they have to get better than 4-8. I don't think anybody expects, double-digit wins or anything off the charts. I don't think there's enough sheer talent for the Tar Heels to be great. But you can ask them to be better. They were an eyesore offensively last year. And whereas they were competitive most of the time defensively, there were some ugly games on that side of the ball as well. So Carolina fans should demand a better coached, more competitive football team that maybe can scratch and claw to 6-6, or in the best case scenario, better than that, and just make a bowl game so that when you're trying to recruit the next generation of transfers and high school recruits, you can show an upward arc as a reason for them to believe that Bill Belichick is headed in the right direction.
Here at the ACC kickoff, I heard a bunch today, and I know you heard it too, where the coaches are talking that we've got a team spirit. The guys are playing for each other. They're more team-oriented. Are you seeing that at UNC, or is it still kind of a mishmash?
It's hard to know. I think it is impressive that in-state products like a Damon June at running back, like a Jordan Shipp at wide receiver, I think it matters that they chose to stay, right? They could have transferred. They chose to stay. And they're going to be asked to be leaders on this football team, even though Jordan Shipp is only a junior and Damon June is only a sophomore. But they're trying to blend a lot of transfers with a lot of returning players. And I'm not sure how many of their incoming transfers are just ready to be great. You know, Billy Edwards has to be really good at quarterback. He's experienced, but he's also had a lot of injuries. Is he the answer? It would help the Tar Heels a lot if he is the answer. How about the offensive line? That was not a strength last year for the Tar Heels. At least 2, maybe more starters are going to be new guys to the Carolina way. How quickly does that group come together? You know, it's a little bit of a guessing game. I do think they started to have more of a defensive identity. Maybe they can build on that as a strong point, but they lost some good players on that side of the ball. And if we were doing a 1 through 17 ACC power rankings, I don't think anybody would have the Tar Heels in that top, let's say, 8 or so, because there's just not enough obvious proven talent to justify that kind of higher ranking.
Yeah, I think I actually saw a preseason power ranking, and they were not in the top 8. They were in the bottom, kind of in the middle of the bottom 8. So as the season starts and progresses, what do you see happening? What are like some of the crucial games that they've got to show up at?
Yeah, Carolina, obviously TCU's a non-conference game. Then they get an open week. Then East Tennessee, you would think that they would iron out some wrinkles against a lesser opponent. But then they have to go to Clemson, and then they have to deal with Notre Dame and Chapel Hill. Clemson was only 7-6 last year, but they're expecting to be better. And Notre Dame is Notre Dame. I mean, I know that game is in Chapel Hill, but the Tar Heels will be underdogs for sure, maybe by a lot, against both Clemson and Notre Dame. And then comes 3 more manageable games. So whatever happens against TCU, Clemson, and Notre Dame, you go to Pitt, you go to Duke, you host Syracuse. You have to be good by then. You have to win at least 2 of those 3 games, if not all 3. I know Duke just won the ACC football title. Syracuse expects to have a bounce-back season. You know, they're not the weak sisters that there once were at the very bottom of the ACC. You know, later in the season, UConn's a toss-up. Virginia could be a toss-up. Carolina has had the worst side of the state-Carolina football rivalry lately, right? Yeah. 5 straight for the Wolfpack, 8 of the last 10 for the Wolfpack. So that's why I said scratch and claw into 6-6 would be an accomplishment for UNC. We know this stuff is unpredictable. Let's put a pin in that, right? 1 year ago, most people thought Clemson would win the ACC title.
Yes, they did.
And they finished 7-6. Few thought Duke or Virginia would be great, and they faced each other in the ACC championship game. So that's how unpredictable this stuff can be. But Carolina needs stars to emerge beyond the ones that I mentioned earlier. And I think we will know that by the end of the month of September. But the Heels have to be ready to win by October because they have 2 open dates in that first month or so of the season.
Let's move a little bit further away from Chatham County. You already mentioned this team is Duke. UNC's the closest, then Duke. What are you seeing? I mean, I'm happy for Manny Diaz. I have a bias because I still remember him as an assistant coach under Chuckamado at NC State. So I'm happy to see him being successful. What do you see for Manny and the Blue Devils going into 2026?
I like Manny as well. He was actually just voted our statewide Coach of the Year by voters at the North Carolina Sports Network. So we have presented him with a Coach of the Year award. He, of course, got a much more important accomplishment, the ACC championship. Duke hadn't shared an ACC title since 1989 in football, and Duke had not won one outright since 1962, before most people around here were even born. So that was an incredible accomplishment. Now, you all know, everybody knows the offseason news. Starting quarterback Darian Mensah transfers to the Miami Hurricanes, and there's a lawsuit involved where Duke has to sue its own player, and they resolve the lawsuit. But the bottom line is Darian Mensah, NFL prospect, star for the Blue Devils last year, star for Tulane the year before that, got out of his 2-year contract 1 year early, and is going to be starting instead for the Miami Hurricanes, who are not only the ACC favorite, but one of the favorites for the college football playoff and the national championship. That hurts because Duke may or may not have good quarterback play now, rather than having a guy is one of the best in the ACC. That hurts a lot. And when you didn't have a lot of time to plan for that change, remember, they didn't know Darian Mensah was leaving until January, well, then that puts you way behind the 8 ball in finding somebody else who can play. So we'll see who emerges from that depth chart. Maybe they have an answer, but they too lost some key players via the transfer portal. So there's no way that Duke is going to go back-to-back trips to the ACC title game. There are too many good teams in this league. Miami, SMU, Louisville, Clemson hopes to bounce back. In our state, we'll get to the NC State Wolfpack a little bit later. But Duke, I think a bowl should be the goal. And I know that sounds strange coming off of an ACC championship, but not only did Darian Mensah leave, star wide receiver Cooper Barkate also followed the quarterback to the Miami Hurricanes. So rather than having 2 of the best players at their position in the entire conference as building blocks for the 2026 Blue Devils, they're both starting in an opponent's uniform. That's not a slight adjustment. That's not like a shade of gray thing. That's painful and hard to overcome. Their star safety, Terry Moore, who was injured this past year, transferred to Ohio State. Quayshawn Brown, the fun wide receiver and return man, is going to be playing for James Franklin at Virginia Tech. It is never a good sign when you see starting players transfer to other Power 4 programs. And I just listed 4 guys where that happened to Duke.
Was that precipitated in part by the QB heading over to Miami? Because Miami was here yesterday, weren't they? And I think
Correct.
The coach was pretty proud of the fact that he got what he got.
Correct, and there's all sorts of tampering allegations and questions about the ethics behind it all. Because remember, Darian Mensah had put out a video celebrating his return to Duke in the month of December.
Right.
But by mid-January, when Miami needed a quarterback, he decided to put his name in the transfer portal instead. Well, something happened between his "I'm returning to Duke" video and putting his name in the transfer portal. You don't blindly put your name in the transfer portal. So Mario Cristobal had to dodge questions and claim, once we saw his name in the transfer portal, and we thought he might be a great fit for the Hurricanes. We all should roll our eyes about those answers from the players or the coaches. Everybody's tampering nowadays. Almost nobody gets penalized for tampering nowadays. And most coaches are just shrugging their shoulders and saying, I guess that's the way it's going to be if the NCAA is not going to enforce its anti-tampering rules. So we don't know the details of every one of those transfers I just gave you, but we do know that they would have been 4 building blocks in the starting lineup for Manny Diaz, 3 of them on the offensive side of the ball. You only start 11 on offense, right? 3 of the 11 will be wearing other teams' uniforms in the ACC rather than starting for the Blue Devils, and that's one of the reasons I think it's realistic to expect a step backward. How big of a step backward from an ACC championship Duke team? Who knows? I do think they're good enough to be a bowl team, but even to make a bowl, you need a productive quarterback. And we're not sure right now whether they have a productive quarterback on the Duke campus.
Is that one of the questions you're going to ask Manny tomorrow when he and the Duke Blue Devils show up here in Charlotte?
Yes. You know, they have a freshman, they have a redshirt freshman, and they have a grad transfer. And the grad transfer is a no-name to the degree that, you know, I'm going to have to look up how to pronounce his name, right? Darian Mensah, we didn't have to look up how to pronounce his name. He was already an all-ACC guy. Walker Eget, I'm not even sure is the correct pronunciation. I'll double check that in time for the season, but you could go from having one of the best quarterback depth charts in the ACC to one of the worst, unless this transfer or one of those freshmen shows up in a big way.
Looking at, again, you looked at the UNC schedule, looking at the Duke schedule for 2026, what are you seeing?
The Blue Devils lost badly to Illinois at home last year, and they have to go to Illinois this year. Tulane has been one of the best teams in the American Conference. Maybe not this year, we'll see. But that's not an easy opening opponent for the Blue Devils. The rest of that slate, they do have to go to Miami. That's an almost sure loss.
See, I was going to ask you about that.
Well, Miami's the best team in this league.
Right.
There's going to be those weird storylines because of Darian Mensah. It would be an absolute shock if the Blue Devils beat the Canes in Coral Gables or in South Florida.
And knowing the history of Manny at Miami,
correct.
That would even make it even, yeah, there's tons of stories.
There's a lot of layers to that cake, as they say. The rest of the schedule is manageable. You know, Stanford has a new head coach. Carolina has its issues. Georgia Tech is good but not overwhelming. Boston College has had issues lately. NC State is good but not overwhelming. Clemson is very talented, but coming off a 7-win season. Wake Forest is good, but not overwhelming. So in conference play, other than that trip to Miami, maybe Duke can have another good season. But it all revolves around how do you do against Tulane and Illinois in the non-conference schedule, because they're not pushovers. And then how do you get, what kind of quarterback play do you get from this new cast of characters, all of whom are learning the Duke way for the first time?